There are days when the past feels like a storm. It sweeps through me, a relentless gale of memories that refuse to settle, reminding me of everything I lost and everything I've tried to rebuild. I've spent 5 years outrunning it, but the call from my parents a few weeks ago tore through my carefully constructed calm. It's strange, this idea that they want to talk, as though words could fill the space that betrayal carved between us. I can feel a flicker of something I thought I'd let go of. Something dangerous and fragile, like a candle flame wavering in a gust. It all started with a single accusation. To this day, I'm still unsure of why my parents, who once trusted me so completely, suddenly turned their backs. The details are hazy now, eroded by years of trying to forget. Yet the weight of it, the pain has never dulled. 5 years ago, I was cast out, marked with a shame I didn't deserve. The memories have softened only in the way a bruise fades but never fully disappears. I still remember the shock, a numb disbelief that froze me as I stood in our small living room. My parents' faces shadowed and unfamiliar. They didn't scream or rage. They didn't even need to raise their voices. The quiet, absolute way they told me I'd disappointed them cut so much deeper. "We're sorry, but we can't have someone like you in this family," they'd said. That phrase, "someone like you," I've played it over in my mind more times than I can count. They didn't just mean I'd made a mistake. They meant they saw me as fundamentally flawed, as though I was no longer their child, as though everything they'd once known about me had been a lie. The world became a cold place that day. In an instant, my family, my home, my past, everything that had shaped me disappeared, leaving me in a vast emptiness that I struggled to navigate. I felt like I was trying to breathe underwater, each day filled with a fog I couldn't see through. In those early days, I searched for some glimmer of understanding. Friends would tell me I needed to move on, or let it go. Easy words to throw out, but they did nothing to fill the aching silence that had replaced my family. The world outside my family felt like an alien planet. Every person I encountered seemed a stranger. Every interaction a reminder of what I'd lost. I spent hours wondering what I'd done to deserve it. I'd replay conversations, moments from childhood, teenage years, searching for any sign, any small action that might have justified their decision. But I found nothing, only questions and a gnawing feeling of inadequacy that wrapped itself around me like chains. As time passed, I came to understand that maybe I'd never have answers. Maybe they'd simply chosen to believe a version of me that didn't exist. They cut me off entirely. No messages, no letters. The silence was louder than any fight we'd ever had. In the quiet of my nights, I would hear their accusations echo in my mind, hollow and dispassionate, and slowly, I let my anger build, feeding it like a fire in the cold loneliness of my exile. I had no choice but to move forward, to build something on the ashes of a family that had abandoned me. But the sense of betrayal lingered, a constant companion. I'd started small, found a job, found an apartment. The first few months were the hardest. There were days I barely ate, living off whatever I could afford, clinging to the few possessions I'd taken with me. Each day was a test of endurance, a long, dragging march toward an unknown future that I tried not to think about too closely. It was survival, nothing more, but in some strange way, it became my new normal. The first thing I realized after they disowned me was just how fragile my life had been without my even knowing it. For years, I'd thought my foundation was solid: a loving family, a secure home, all the things you take for granted until they're gone. It wasn't until I was forced out, alone, that I saw how much of my life had been held together by those roots. With nowhere to go and only a few $100s saved, I ended up sleeping on a friend's couch for a few weeks, waiting for the panic to wear off. Every night, lying there in the dark, I felt a knot of despair twist tighter in my chest, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. The humiliation of it all was hard to shake. Every interaction felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, acting normal when inside, I felt completely fractured. Eventually, I knew I couldn't live that way forever. I couldn't keep leaning on friends who had their own lives and families, lives they hadn't been exiled from. I had to stand on my own, to survive, if only to prove that I could. I found a small, dim apartment in a neighborhood that didn't ask questions and managed to scrape together a job at a local cafe. It was humble work, but it was mine, something I could cling to. The days became routine. Wake up, work, go home. On some level, it was a relief to sink into the numbness of it, letting the rhythm of making coffee, wiping counters, and taking orders occupy my mind. I could pretend for a few hours that I was just another person with a normal life, that I wasn't carrying around a wound I couldn't heal. But every night, when I closed the door to my apartment, the silence was unbearable. The pain, though, wasn't just from the silence. It was from all the small moments that reminded me of what I'd lost. Seeing parents walk with their kids, hearing coworkers casually mention their family plans, even the sound of a phone ringing in someone else's pocket, all of it brought a tightness to my throat that I struggled to swallow down. Family had been such a constant, such a certainty. Now, every day was a struggle to redefine myself without it. In time, I began to make a few friends. There was Claire, a regular at the cafe who always ordered her coffee black and loved to talk about books. She was a warm presence, kind in a way that reminded me of my mother in the early days, before everything went wrong. And then there was Marcus, who worked the early shift with me and had an irreverent sense of humor that could make even the grumpiest customers laugh. I didn't tell them about my family. I didn't need to. They accepted me as I was, and for that, I was grateful. Still, there was a barrier I couldn't cross. No matter how close I became with these new people, I kept a part of myself hidden, locked away like a secret. It was as if some part of me believed that if they really knew, if they saw the broken pieces of my life, they'd abandon me too. I learned to smile, to laugh at their jokes, to play the part of someone whole. But inside, I knew that I was holding on to my new life by the thinnest of threads. Months turned into years, and slowly, I built something that looked like a life. I found small pleasures in the everyday, even if they didn't fill the empty spaces. I learned to appreciate the comfort of routine, of having a place to come back to each night. Even if that place was quiet and lonely, I became resilient in ways I never thought possible. I grew tougher, more guarded, but also more resourceful. I stopped looking for my family in the faces of strangers, stopped hoping that each phone call might be from someone reaching out to make amends. I told myself I was better off this way, that I was free, but every now and then, the old ache would rise up, catching me off guard. It was the ache of unspoken words, of questions left unanswered. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but part of me still longed for the impossible, for an explanation. A reason, anything that could help me understand why my parents had thrown me away. In moments of weakness, I'd let my mind wander back to those days, wondering if they ever thought about me, if they ever missed me. 5 years passed in this way, each one blending into the next, each one another layer of distance between me and the life I once knew. I told myself I was strong, that I didn't need them. I told myself that my parents were a part of my past, a chapter I'd left behind. But the truth was that I'd built my life on top of a wound that had never fully healed. And then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message that would unravel everything. Life has a way of surprising you just when you think you've settled into its rhythm. Like a sudden gust of wind sweeping through a quiet street. That afternoon, everything felt ordinary, the kind of dull, forgettable day that blends into every other. I had just finished my shift at the cafe, muscles aching from the long hours, my mind already drifting to the evening ahead, leftovers, a book, and an early night. Routine, predictable, safe. But then my phone buzzed. At first, I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to glance at the message. It's Mom and Dad, we'd like to talk. Those few words, so simple, so ordinary on the surface, hit me like a punch to the gut. The screen blurred in front of my eyes, and my mind went blank. It felt surreal, as though someone had taken my life and twisted it, opening a door I'd long thought sealed shut. I sat down, my hands trembling, and reread the message. 5 years of silence, of anger and hurt, suddenly resurfaced, rising up like a wave that had been building beneath the surface, waiting for this exact moment to crash. My first reaction was disbelief. After all these years, after they'd cut me out of their lives without a second thought, they now wanted to talk. The absurdity of it stung. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind. We'd like to talk. A cold anger settled in my chest. What gave them the right to reach out after everything they'd done? Did they think a few words would undo the years of pain? That I'd just drop everything and forgive them because they finally decided I was worth talking to? But beneath the anger, beneath the resentment that had sustained me for so long, was something else, something I'd tried to ignore for years, a flicker of longing, fragile and persistent. Despite everything, some small part of me still wanted to hear from them. The very idea made me feel weak, foolish, but it was there, gnawing at me, reminding me of the love I'd once felt, of the family I'd lost. My mind began racing with questions, each one cutting deeper than the last. What had changed? Why now? After all these years, did they regret what they'd done? Or was this just another form of cruelty? A way to remind me of everything I'd lost? I could feel my pulse pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The urge to respond, to demand answers, to confront them with all the pain they'd caused was overwhelming. But I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, unsure of what I would even say. Every word I thought of felt inadequate, like it could never convey the depth of what I'd endured. Instead, I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked home in a daze. My mind a tangled mess of anger and confusion. The familiar sights of the city blurred around me, each step bringing me closer to the sanctuary of my small apartment. Once inside, I sank into the warm fabric of my couch, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I pulled out my phone again and read the message for the 5th time. I tried to imagine what they wanted to say. Part of me hoped for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the hurt they'd caused. But another part of me, the part that had been burned before, knew better. After all, they believed the worst of me once. What would stop them from doing it again? I didn't know if I could face that kind of betrayal a second time. I'd barely survived it the first. In the days that followed, the message haunted me. I'd wake up thinking about it, my heart racing before my mind was even fully awake. At work, I'd catch myself drifting off, replaying scenes from the past, moments I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered family dinners, laughter echoing through the house, my mother's soft smile, my father's steady presence, and then, as sharply as a knife, I'd remember the day they disowned me, the cold finality in their voices, the way they'd closed the door on me without a second glance. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I'd fought to rebuild. I tried to push it all aside, telling myself that I didn't need them, that I was better off alone, but the truth gnawed at me, relentless in its persistence. For all the anger I held onto, there was still a part of me, a vulnerable, wounded part that longed for closure, for answers. I needed to know why they'd abandoned me so easily, why they'd decided to reach out now. Finally, after days of wrestling with myself, I came to a decision. I couldn't ignore the message forever, it would only fester, becoming another source of regret. So, with a mix of trepidation and defiance, I sent a short reply. When? The response came almost immediately, as if they'd been waiting. This Saturday, at home, please. My heart skipped a beat. Home. The word felt foreign, almost laughable after everything that had happened. That house was a place I hadn't set foot in for years. A place I'd buried along with all the memories of my family. The thought of returning there filled me with dread, but a strange, inexplicable pull urged me forward. I told myself it was closure I wanted, a chance to finally put the past behind me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. As Saturday approached, my emotions spiraled in every direction, a storm I couldn't control. I was angry, terrified, curious, hopeful, and devastated all at once. I spent hours pacing my apartment, replaying conversations in my mind, imagining every possible outcome. I braced myself for disappointment, for another wound that would take years to heal. But I couldn't turn away, not after all this time. On the day of the meeting, I stood outside the door of my apartment, my hand trembling as I locked it behind me. Each step down the hallway felt like a march towards something inevitable, a fate I couldn't escape. The drive back to my hometown was filled with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. Familiar landmarks blurred past, each one stirring memories I'd buried long ago. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, I arrived at the house that had once been home. I stood at the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding, as I took in the sight of the house I'd left behind. It looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by the years. Just like me, part of me wanted to turn around, to run as far and as fast as I could. But I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and walked toward the front door. As I raised my hand to knock, I hesitated, a final moment of doubt holding me back. But then, with a sense of resignation, I knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon air. And just like that, the door opened. The door swung open, and there they were, my parents. The people who had once been my entire world and, for the last 5 years, the source of my deepest hurt. Standing there on the threshold, I felt like a stranger to them, and they to me. They looked older, wearier. My father's hair was streaked with grey, and my mother's face, once so warm and familiar, held lines that hadn't been there before. In that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if they saw the changes in me too. If they recognized the toll their decision had taken. My mother stepped aside, motioning for me to come in, and I forced myself to cross the threshold. The house smelled the same faintly of vanilla and old wood, a scent that felt strangely comforting despite everything. I could feel the memories press in around me, like ghosts hovering in the corners, reminders of a time when this house had been a sanctuary. Now, it felt foreign, like a place I no longer belonged to. The three of us moved awkwardly to the living room, the same room where they'd disowned me all those years ago. Sitting on the couch, I felt a strange mixture of déjà vu and dread, like I was reliving a nightmare. My mother sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting toward my father as if searching for some kind of guidance. My father, usually so composed, was staring down at the carpet, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't know where to begin. I had rehearsed so many things I wanted to say, questions I wanted to ask, but in that moment, all of it slipped away, leaving me with a hollow, aching feeling in my chest. I felt like a child again, waiting for them to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, some reason that would make sense of everything, but they just sat there, as if caught in the same storm of emotions that I was. Finally, my mother cleared her throat. Her voice was quiet, almost tentative, as if she were afraid of breaking the fragile peace between us. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes flickering up to meet mine. There was something in her gaze, regret, perhaps, or maybe even shame, but it was subtle, hidden beneath layers of reserve, as if she didn't know how to let it show. I nodded, my jaw tight, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand why they'd thrown me away so easily, but another part of me was frozen, caught between anger and the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they had come to their senses. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The silence between us was filled with years of unspoken words, of wounds that had never healed. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, my throat dry as I waited, hoping they would say something, anything that could give me a reason to forgive them. My father finally looked up, his gaze heavy, almost as if he were carrying some invisible weight. He began, his voice rougher than I remembered. We know we hurt you, and we don't expect you to forgive us, but we wanted to try to explain. Explain. The word sent a chill down my spine. Could there really be an explanation for what they'd done? Could anything justify the way they had abandoned me, left me to fend for myself without a second thought? But I forced myself to stay silent, to give them a chance to speak. Maybe they had reasons I hadn't considered, reasons that might finally bring me some kind of closure. My mother's hands twisted in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly. We were wrong, she said, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. We believed things about you that weren't true. We made assumptions, and she trailed off, her eyes filling with a sadness I hadn't expected. Hearing those words, a mix of emotions surged through me: anger, bitterness, but also something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Relief, maybe, or the faintest hint of validation. For years, I had carried the weight of their rejection, questioning myself, wondering if there had been something about me that deserved their judgment. But now, hearing my mother admit they'd been wrong, I felt a crack in the armor I'd built around myself. We thought, my father began, his voice faltering. He looked away, his face drawn and pained. We were told things that made us doubt you, and we didn't stop to question them. We didn't give you a chance to explain yourself. There it was, the admission, the confession I had waited for, though it felt empty and far too late. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell them that their words were meaningless after all the years I'd spent alone. But instead, I stayed silent, letting their words hang in the air, trying to absorb the weight of them. They had believed lies about me, accepted them without question, and yet, now that I was here, looking into their tired, remorseful faces, I couldn't help but wonder what those lies had been. What could possibly have been so damning that they had turned their backs on me so completely? As if reading my thoughts, my mother looked at me, her eyes dark with a guilt I hadn't expected to see. We were told things about your character, things that made us believe. She hesitated, swallowing hard. That made us believe you were someone we couldn't trust. The words stung, even after all this time, but there was something in her tone, a hint of regret that softened the blow. For years, I had told myself that they hadn't cared, that they had thrown me away without a second thought. But now, sitting here with them, I could see the shadows of doubt and remorse that lingered in their expressions. I wanted to ask who had told them these things. What lies had been spun about me that had poisoned their love so completely? But the words stuck in my throat, caught between the anger that still burned within me and a tentative, fragile desire to let go of the past. In the silence, my father cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. We know it's too late to make things right. We know that, but we wanted to tell you the truth, that we were wrong. They looked at me, their eyes filled with a raw vulnerability I had never seen before. For the first time, I saw them not as my parents, but as people flawed, broken, carrying their own regrets. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my own anger begin to loosen, if only slightly. I didn't know if I could forgive them. I didn't know if I even wanted to try. But sitting there, I could feel a sliver of understanding, a recognition of the pain we had all endured, each in our own way. The visit stretched on, each minute filled with unspoken words, with a sense of loss that hung over us like a cloud. I wanted to find some way to bridge the distance between us, to take a step toward healing, but the hurt was still too fresh, the scars too deep. For now, it was enough that they had admitted their wrongs, that they had shown me a part of themselves I hadn't seen before. As I left that day, walking back to my car in the fading light, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. The visit had left me raw, vulnerable, but also strangely lighter. They hadn't given me the answers I'd hoped for, but they had opened a door, however tentative, for the possibility of something different. In the silence of the car, as I drove away from the house that had once been my home, I felt a faint, hesitant flicker of hope. It was fragile, easily extinguished, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Driving away from my parents' house, the tension that had coiled tightly inside me began to unravel. The confession, their attempt to explain it, had left me raw, as if they had reopened an old wound and then left it bleeding. I felt exhausted, like every step, every movement, weighed twice as much as it should. The drive back to my apartment was a blur, with familiar landmarks flashing by in the dimming twilight. Memories kept surfacing, one after another, refusing to let me escape. It was as if that single visit had unlocked a part of my mind I had tried to keep closed. A part that held the fragments of my past, the pieces of a family I'd spent so long resenting. So long trying to forget. As I pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment and cut the engine, the weight of it all pressed down on me, filling the car with silence that felt too thick to bear. My parents' faces lingered in my mind. Their expressions haunted, remorseful. I had expected anger from them, or perhaps defensiveness. Instead, they had shown regret, vulnerability even, and that was somehow harder to face. I sat there, staring out the windshield as memories began to swirl in my mind, refusing to be held back. They came in flashes, vivid and relentless. I remembered being 6 or 7 years old, my mother sitting beside me in bed, reading to me from my favorite book. She had this way of making every word come to life, her voice soft and warm, her eyes sparkling as she brought each character to life. That was who she was back then, someone who made even the smallest moments feel magical. I couldn't reconcile that memory with the woman who had disowned me, who had stood silent and unyielding as she turned her back on me. Then there was my father, his quiet strength, his unwavering presence. He wasn't one for grand gestures, but he was always there, steady and reliable, like an anchor. I remembered him teaching me how to ride a bike in the front yard, his hands steady on my shoulders, his voice reassuring as he encouraged me to keep going. He hadn't let go until he was sure I could do it on my own. I couldn't understand how the same man had been so quick to believe lies about me, to let go so easily when I needed him most. The memories kept coming, each one cutting deeper, peeling back the layers of resentment I had built around myself over the years. I had tried to bury these moments, to convince myself that they didn't matter, that they were just fragments of a past life I no longer belonged to. But now, sitting alone in the silence of my car, I realized that these memories were a part of me, whether I wanted them to be or not. There was the Christmas when I was 10, the year we'd had a terrible storm that knocked out the power. My parents had turned it into an adventure, lighting candles all over the house, telling stories by the fire. We spent hours huddled together under blankets, laughing and talking as the storm raged outside. It was one of the happiest nights of my life, a memory so warm it hurt to remember it now, knowing how far we had drifted from that family, from that sense of closeness and security. But the painful memories came too, unbidden and sharp. I remembered the day they told me to leave, the way my father's face had been set, cold and unyielding, the disbelief I'd felt as my mother stood beside him, her expression closed off, her gaze refusing to meet mine. It was as if they had already decided who I was, as if they were looking at a stranger instead of the child they'd raised. That memory was a wound that hadn't healed, a jagged scar that still ached every time I thought about it. For years, I had told myself that they didn't care, that they had never truly loved me. It was easier to hate them, to hold on to the anger and let it harden me. But now, with their confession still fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but question everything. Had they believed what they'd heard because they hadn't known me well enough to see the truth? Or had they simply been afraid, too blinded by doubt to recognize their own child? The questions twisted inside me, each one leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I had spent so long trying to build a life without them, trying to forget the family I had lost. But now, with the possibility of reconciliation hanging in the air, I felt trapped between the past and the present, unsure of which path to take. The thought of forgiving them felt impossible, like a betrayal of the pain I had endured, the loneliness that had shaped me. And yet, some small part of me, a part one had tried to bury, wanted to believe that they could change. That maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. Maybe they did regret what they'd done. Maybe they had finally realized the depth of the hurt they had caused. As I sat there, lost in memories, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could keep holding on to the anger, the resentment that had fueled me for so long, or I could try to let go, to see if there was a way to move forward. It wasn't about forgiving them. Not yet. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But maybe there was a way to find some semblance of peace. To let the past be the past and stop letting it define me. The decision weighed heavily on me, like a stone in my chest. I knew that whatever I chose, it would shape the person I would become. I could keep running, keep hiding from the pain, or I could face it head on, take the risk of opening myself up to the possibility of something different. In the days that followed, the memories continued to haunt me, drifting in and out of my mind like whispers. They were a reminder of what I had lost, but also of the love that had once been there. A love that maybe, just maybe, could be rebuilt. I didn't know if I could ever forgive them fully, if I could ever let go of the hurt they had caused. But I knew that I had to try, if only for my own sake. And so, slowly, I began to consider the possibility of another meeting. Perhaps this time, with fewer expectations, fewer demands, just a conversation, a chance to see if there was anything left to salvage. I didn't know what I was hoping for, or if I was even ready to face them again. But the memories wouldn't let me go. And deep down, I knew that I couldn't keep running forever. I had spent years living with the shadows of my past, letting them shape me, define me. Now, it was time to confront them, to face the people who had once been my family, and to decide for myself what I wanted from the future. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a beginning, a glimmer of hope that perhaps, in facing the past, I could find a way to finally let it go. The days leading up to our second meeting felt surreal, like walking through a fog I couldn't shake. Memories from the past mingled with the doubts and fears of the present, creating a kind of tension I couldn't escape. I kept wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was opening myself up to more pain by giving him another chance. But the pull to go, to confront them again, was stronger than my fear. There was something I needed to know, something that no amount of distance could answer. The morning of the meeting was grey and overcast, a fitting reflection of my own mood. I spent the drive replaying our last conversation, the broken confessions, the halting apologies. In the quiet of my car, I could almost hear their voices again, heavy with regret. The memory left a hollow ache in my chest, a mixture of anger and something else I couldn't name. It was too soon to call it hope, but it was there, fragile and persistent. I arrived early, parking on the street just a few houses down. Sitting there in the stillness, I watched the familiar outline of their house, noting the small changes over the years. The garden my mother had once tended so carefully was overgrown. The paint on the porch railings chipped and faded. It looked neglected, a shadow of the place I had once known. In some ways, it mirrored how I felt, changed, worn down by the years of separation. After a few moments of hesitation, I forced myself out of the car, the weight of my decision pressing down on me with every step toward the door. My hand trembled slightly as I knocked, and I felt a familiar surge of anxiety, the same feeling I'd had as a child when I feared disappointing them. Only now, that fear was tangled with resentment, a reminder of the chasm that had grown between us. The door opened, and my mother stood there, her face softening as she took in the sight of me. I could see the relief in her eyes, as if she'd been holding her breath, waiting for me to change my mind. She stepped aside, wordlessly inviting me in, and I entered, my heart pounding in my chest. My father was in the living room, standing by the window, looking out as if lost in thought. He turned when he heard me, his expression unreadable. There was a stiffness in his posture, a guardedness that matched my own. I could tell that he was struggling, that this was just as difficult for him as it was for me. But he made no move to close the distance between us, and I felt the space between us grow heavier. We sat down, each of us settling into our own chairs, as if some invisible line kept us apart. The silence stretched, thick with words unsaid, and I found myself gripping the edge of the chair, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I hadn't prepared for this, hadn't prepared for the flood of emotions that seeing him again would bring. After a moment, my mother spoke, her voice tentative. "Thank you for coming back," she said softly. Her gaze was steady, but I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the unspoken plea for understanding. She seemed smaller somehow, as though the years had worn her down in ways I hadn't noticed before. I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't trust myself to speak, afraid that if I opened my mouth, the anger and hurt would come spilling out, raw and unfiltered. Instead, I forced myself to listen, to give them a chance to explain, even if it was the last thing I wanted to do. My father cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. "We know we can't undo what we did," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "but we want you to know that we regret it. We've regretted it every day." I could feel the resentment stirring within me, a bitter reminder of the years I'd spent alone, cut off from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It took everything in me to keep my voice steady as I replied. "Why now?" I asked, my words clipped, each one carrying the weight of my anger. "Why, after all these years?" My father's gaze finally met mine, and I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, a shadow of the guilt he carried. "We didn't know how to reach out. We thought it was too late." The words struck a nerve, hitting at the heart of my own fears and insecurities. They had spent years believing that I wouldn't want to hear from them, just as I had spent years believing that they had forgotten about me. It was a strange, bitter irony, a reminder of how deeply we had misunderstood each other. "We were afraid," my mother added quietly, "afraid that we had lost you for good." I felt a pang of something I couldn't name, an echo of the love I had once felt, the bond that had once held us together, but it was buried beneath layers of hurt, layers that I wasn't ready to strip away. "I needed you," I whispered, my voice breaking, "and you weren't there." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging between us like a physical presence. I could see the guilt in their faces, the way my father's shoulders slumped, the way my mother's eyes filled with unshed tears. They looked at me, and for the first time, I felt that they truly understood the depth of the pain they had caused. "I know we failed you," my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we were protecting ourselves, but we were wrong. We hurt you, and that's something we'll have to live with." Hearing him admit it, hearing the regret in his voice, left me feeling both vindicated and hollow. This was what I had wanted, a confession, an acknowledgement of the hurt they had inflicted. But now that I had it, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The anger that had fueled me for so long was beginning to fade, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. We sat in silence for a long time, the air thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I didn't know what forgiveness would look like, or if I was even capable of offering it, but I could see that they were trying, that they were finally willing to face the pain they had caused. And in that moment, I felt something shift within me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding, a tentative step toward healing. I realized that I didn't have to make a decision right now. I didn't have to let go of the hurt all at once. I could take it one step at a time, finding my own way forward. As I stood to leave, my mother reached out, her hand brushing against mine in a gesture so familiar it nearly brought me to tears. "Please," she said softly, her voice filled with hope. "Give us a chance to make it right." I looked at her, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and felt a pang of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't ready to let go of the anger and resentment that had been my shield. But maybe, just maybe, I could give them a chance to show me they had changed. With a nod, I turned and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of my decision settle around me. As I stepped outside, the cool air washed over me, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of peace. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if we could ever truly rebuild what had been broken. But I knew that I was ready to try, to face the past and see if there was a way forward. And in that small, quiet moment, I felt the first stirrings of hope. The weeks that followed our second meeting felt like I was navigating uncharted territory, where every step forward was tentative, uncertain. My parents and I had opened a door, but the path beyond it was murky, shadowed by years of distrust and hurt. I'd never expected to be here, hovering between resentment and reconciliation, caught in a fragile truce with the people who had once been my family. We started small, cautiously feeling our way forward. My mother would text me now and then, simple messages, "How are you?" or "Hope your day is going well," phrases that felt almost foreign in her voice. Sometimes, I would find myself staring at the messages, unsure how to respond. What was I supposed to say to the woman who had once turned her back on me? Yet, at the same time, a part of me was grateful for her reaching out, however awkwardly, as though she were trying to bridge the gap between us. My father, on the other hand, remained distant. He rarely reached out directly, his voice still echoing with the same restraint I remembered from our meetings. But I could sense the effort in his silence, the way he'd defer to my mother, letting her take the lead in our tentative reconnecting. It was as though he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of undoing the small progress we'd made. For now, that was enough. I didn't expect him to change overnight. I didn't expect him to undo the past with a few words. I only wanted him to try. The first time we met in person after that second visit, it felt like a strange dance. They invited me to lunch, something casual at a local diner we used to visit when I was younger. Walking in, I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing with old memories. Every corner of the place was familiar, the smell of coffee, the vinyl booths, the quiet hum of conversation. It was strange, seeing him there, seated across from me, trying so hard to look natural. The conversation was hesitant, filled with small talk that felt forced. We discussed the weather, work, even trivial things like a recent football game my father had watched. The topics were safe, neutral, as though we were all tiptoeing around a landmine, afraid to trigger an explosion. I could feel the tension beneath each word, the unspoken questions and doubts lurking beneath the surface. At one point, my mother asked about my job, her voice filled with a genuine curiosity that took me by surprise. She wanted to know about my day-to-day work, my colleagues, even the small, mundane details of my life. It felt strange, answering her questions, sharing parts of my life that I had long since come to consider private. But her interest seemed sincere, and as I spoke, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a small, tentative bond forming between us. However fragile, the lunch ended awkwardly, each of us unsure how to say goodbye. As I walked back to my car, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, as if I'd just finished running a marathon. The meeting had been difficult, filled with unspoken tension and hesitant words. But it was a start. A small step, yes, but a step nonetheless. Over the next few weeks, we continued to meet occasionally, each encounter a little easier than the last. We fell into a routine of sorts, a rhythm that felt almost comfortable, though there was always an underlying tension, a sense of unfinished business that neither of us was ready to face. There were moments, though, when the cracks in our uneasy peace began to show. One afternoon, during a quiet walk with my father, he mentioned the accusations that had torn us apart. His voice cautious, almost regretful. I felt my defenses rise instantly, my heart pounding as the familiar anger flared up. We hadn't spoken directly about that day, not since the initial confession, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. "We were wrong," he said softly, his eyes distant, "but you have to understand, we thought we were protecting ourselves. We thought we were doing the right thing." The words struck a nerve. filling me with a wave of frustration and hurt. It was as though he was trying to justify their actions, trying to make me understand something that I didn't want to accept. I felt the familiar resentment building within me, the anger that I had tried so hard to keep at bay. But looking at him, at the quiet regret in his eyes, I forced myself to stay silent, to keep my emotions in check. I know it's not an excuse, he added, his voice barely above a whisper. But we're trying to make it right. The words hung in the air between us, filled with a weight that neither of us could ignore. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't enough, that nothing could make up for the years of hurt and loneliness I had endured. But at the same time, I could see the sincerity in his gaze, the unspoken plea for forgiveness that he didn't know how to express. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to let go of the anger, if only for a moment. It wasn't about forgiving him, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, it was about finding a way to move forward, to let go of the past without letting it define me. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see my parents not as the people who had hurt me, but as people who were trying, however imperfectly, to rebuild what we had lost. It was a slow, painful process, filled with moments of doubt and hesitation. There were days when the anger resurfaced, when I found myself questioning their motives, wondering if they truly understood the depth of the pain they had caused. But each time, I forced myself to remember that they, too, were human, flawed and vulnerable, just like me. The uneasy peace between us became a kind of fragile foundation, a tentative truce that allowed us to rebuild our relationship one small step at a time. I didn't know if I could ever fully trust them again, or if I could ever truly let go of the hurt, but I knew that I was willing to try, to see if there was a way to find a new kind of connection. One that wasn't built on the past, but on the possibility of something different. And slowly, as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel a shift within myself. The anger, the resentment that had once been my constant companion, began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I didn't have to forgive them completely, didn't have to forget the pain they had caused, but I could find a way to let go, to move forward without letting the past hold me back. In the end, our relationship remained imperfect, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved hurt. But it was a beginning, a chance to find peace in the midst of the brokenness. And for now, that was enough. In the quiet that followed our tentative reconciliation, I found myself drawn back to memories I'd tried to bury, fragments of a life that no longer felt like mine. The past lingered in my mind, slipping into my thoughts when I least expected it, like a song I couldn't forget. Each memory seemed to carry a piece of the puzzle, a hint of the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of my family's betrayal. One evening, I sat by my apartment window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. My parents' faces lingered in my mind, their voices from our recent meetings echoing in my head. They had confessed to being wrong, to believing lies about me, but neither of them had fully explained the details, the who, the why, and in their silence, my curiosity grew, fueled by a need to finally understand what had happened, to make sense of the events that had shattered my life. I decided to ask my mother. She had always been the more open of the two, more willing to talk about emotions, about the complexities of family. It took a few days to summon the courage, and when I finally called her, my voice wavered, betraying the uncertainty I felt. "There's something I need to understand," I said, my heart pounding. "I want to know why you believe the things you did. What made you turn against me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt as if she were gathering her thoughts, trying to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, hesitant. "I don't know if you'll understand," she began, "but at the time, we were dealing with things that had nothing to do with you. Financial worries, pressures we didn't talk about. When we heard," she trailed off, and I could sense the struggle within her, the conflict between regret and the need to explain. "We were told things by people we trusted," she continued, her voice strained, "things that seemed to confirm suspicions we'd let ourselves believe." It was as if she were trying to be vague, perhaps to protect me from the full weight of their betrayal, or maybe to protect herself from the shame that came with it. But her words only deepened my resolve to find the truth. I needed to understand how people I had trusted so deeply could believe the worst of me, based on hearsay and suspicion. I hung up that night feeling both closer to understanding and further away from peace. Her words had opened a door, a glimpse into the doubts that had festered within my family, doubts that someone, perhaps a friend or relative, had taken advantage of, and with that realization came a new resolve. I would find out who had planted those seeds of doubt. Who had poisoned my parents' trust in me? The next time I saw my father, I decided to ask him directly. We were sitting in the park, watching the autumn leaves fall in soft cascades of red and gold. I waited for a lull in our conversation before turning to him, my voice steady but firm. "Who was it?" I asked. "Who made you doubt me?" He looked at me, startled, and I saw a flicker of something regret, perhaps, or shame. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from mine. For a long moment, he was silent, as if weighing his words, debating whether to tell me the truth. It was your aunt, he said finally, his voice heavy. She told us things, hints, suspicions. We trusted her. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. My aunt, my mother's sister, had always been close to our family. A presence at every holiday, every birthday, a voice of authority that my parents often turned to for advice. She had been a part of my life since childhood, a figure of warmth and familiarity. And now, to think that she had played a role in my family's betrayal felt like a betrayal on a deeper level. One that I hadn't been prepared for. I tried to keep my emotions in check, but the hurt was too raw, too immediate. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why would she do that? My father sighed, his expression somber. I don't know, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. Looking back, maybe she felt threatened, or maybe she just didn't understand you. But at the time, we were vulnerable, and we let ourselves believe things we shouldn't have. The words stung, each one a reminder of the trust they had broken, the family I had lost. My aunt, the woman who had once been like a second mother to me, had sown the seeds of doubt that had torn my family apart. I couldn't understand it, couldn't reconcile the image of her I'd held for so long with the reality of what she had done. And yet, there it was, a truth that I couldn't ignore, a betrayal that ran deeper than I had ever imagined. In the days that followed, I felt the weight of this new knowledge settle over me, a heavy, suffocating presence that I couldn't shake. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew that it would do no good. She had made her choice, had chosen to poison my family's trust, and nothing I said would change that. Instead, I turned inward, reflecting on the impact of her betrayal, the way it had shaped me, defined me. For years, I had let the anger and hurt control me, had let it dictate the choices I made, the person I became. But now, with the truth finally out in the open, I felt something begin to shift within me. The anger was still there, but it was tempered by a new understanding, a realization that the past didn't have to hold me captive. I spent hours walking through the city, letting my thoughts drift, trying to process the truth. I thought about my parents, their vulnerability, the way they had been manipulated by someone they trusted. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of empathy, a recognition of the fear and confusion they must have felt. They had made mistakes, had let their doubts cloud their judgment, but they were trying to make amends, trying to rebuild the trust they had lost. And in that quiet, reflective space, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past, or excusing the pain they had caused. It was about finding a way to move forward, to let go of the anger and resentment that had held me back for so long. It was about choosing to release myself from the burden of the past, to find peace in the face of betrayal. The next time I saw my parents, I felt a new sense of calm, a quiet resolve that I hadn't felt before. We sat in their living room, the same room where they had once told me to leave, and for the first time, I felt a sense of acceptance, a recognition that this was a new beginning. However fragile, they looked at me, their expressions filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty, as though they were waiting for me to say something, to give them a sign that I was ready to move forward. And as I looked at them, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift, replaced by a sense of clarity, a sense of peace. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, I said quietly, my voice steady, but I'm ready to try. I'm ready to find a way to move forward. The relief in their faces was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we had been on, the pain we had all endured. They nodded, their eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, I felt a sense of unity, a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what had been broken. As I left that day, I felt a lightness in my chest, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. The past would always be a part of me, a chapter in my story, but it no longer held me captive. I was ready to let go, to embrace the possibility of forgiveness, and to find peace in the face of betrayal. Rebuilding trust isn't a smooth road. It's a winding, uneven path, marked by small steps forward and sudden, unexpected setbacks. In the days after I'd learned the truth, that my aunt had planted the seeds of doubt that had fractured my family, I felt a quiet relief. The mystery of why my parents had turned on me had finally been revealed. But that relief was tempered by a lingering bitterness, an anger I hadn't anticipated. Every time I thought about my aunt, the resentment flared up anew. She had betrayed me in the most intimate way, tearing apart the foundation of my life without a second thought. The pain of her betrayal ran deeper than I cared to admit. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had robbed me of something I would never get back. I was careful not to bring up my aunt with my parents. They had already shared as much as they could, and pressing him further felt pointless. But that didn't stop the questions from haunting me, questions that lingered in the background, casting a shadow over every interaction with my family. What had motivated her to turn against me? Why had she chosen to believe the worst about me, without any evidence or reason? As I spent more time with my parents, I found myself scrutinizing their every word, their every action, looking for signs that they, too, might betray me again. It was an exhausting way to live, constantly on guard, constantly waiting for the next blow to fall. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't silence the small, insistent voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "Be careful, don't let them in too close." One afternoon, as we sat together in my parents' living room, I felt that tension flare up again. We were flipping through an old photo album, reliving memories from a time before everything had fallen apart. There was a picture of my 5th birthday, my parents smiling as I blew out the candles, my aunt in the background, her expression one of warmth and pride. I stared at her face, struggling to reconcile the image of the woman I'd loved with the reality of what she had done. She was always a big part of our lives. My mother murmured, her voice soft, I can't believe we let her convince us of such terrible things." The admission caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of resentment that I struggled to suppress. My mother's words were well-meaning, but they felt hollow. How could they have been so easily swayed, so willing to believe the worst about me based on someone else's word? "It's hard for me to understand," I said, my voice tight, "how you could have doubted me so completely, so easily. Wasn't there a part of you that questioned it, that knew it couldn't be true?" The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. My parents exchanged a glance, a silent exchange that only deepened my frustration. They had apologized, had shown remorse, but there were still cracks in their story, fragments of truth that I couldn't piece together. We were in a bad place. My father said finally, his voice low, "Financially, emotionally, we were vulnerable. And your aunt, she knew that. She played on our fears, on our insecurities. It doesn't excuse what we did, but it's the truth." Hearing him say it, hearing the raw vulnerability in his voice, softened something inside me, even as it stirred up a fresh wave of anger. They had been manipulated, yes, but they had also allowed themselves to be manipulated, had let their doubts and insecurities take precedence over their love for me. It was a hard truth to accept, a reminder of just how easily trust could be shattered. In the weeks that followed, I found myself wrestling with this truth, struggling to make sense of the complexity of my feelings. I had spent so long seeing my parents as the villains in my story, the people who had betrayed me without a second thought. But now, with the truth laid bare, I realized that the lines between victim and villain were blurred, that the reality was far more complicated than I had once believed. My aunt's betrayal loomed large in my mind, casting a shadow over every interaction with my family. I wanted to move forward, to let go of the resentment that still simmered within me, but I found myself trapped, unable to forgive her for the damage she had caused. She was family, and yet, she had acted with a cruelty that felt unforgivable. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself writing a letter I would never send, addressed to my aunt, filled with the anger and hurt I hadn't been able to express. I wrote about the years I'd lost, the trust that had been shattered, the pain that had shaped me. Each word felt like a release, a way to purge the resentment that had taken root within me. "You stole my family," I wrote, my hand trembling. "You took away everything I loved, everything I trusted. I don't know why you did it, and maybe you'll never understand, but I won't let you define my life. I won't let your betrayal hold me captive." When I finished, I sat back, my chest heaving, the weight of my emotions settling over me like a blanket. The letter would remain unsent, a silent testament to the pain I had endured, a way to finally let go of the anger that had held me prisoner for so long. In the days that followed, I felt a quiet shift within myself, a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in years. My aunt's betrayal was a part of my story, a scar that would always remain, but it no longer had the power to control me, to shape the person I was becoming. I began to see my parents in a new light, recognizing their vulnerability, their humanity. They had been deceived, yes, but they had also been willing to face their mistakes, to seek forgiveness even when they didn't deserve it. And that, I realized, was a kind of courage in itself, a willingness to face the past, to try to make amends despite the pain they had caused. Our relationship was far from perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the old hurt resurfaced, raw and unhealed, but each time, I reminded myself that healing wasn't a straight line, that forgiveness was a process, a choice I would have to make again and again. In the quiet moments, I felt a sense of peace, a recognition that I was no longer bound by the past, no longer defined by the betrayals I had endured. I was free to choose my own path, to define my own future, free from the shadows that had once held me captive. As I looked back on the journey, on the painful truths I had uncovered, I felt a newfound strength, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and forgiveness. I had faced the cracks in my family's story, had confronted the people who had once hurt me, and in doing so, I had found a way to heal, to move forward without letting the past hold me back. The scars would always remain, a testament to the battles I had fought, the pain I had survived, but I no longer saw them as a mark of weakness. They were a reminder of my strength, my resilience, a sign that I had overcome the darkness, had found a way to reclaim my life and my identity. In the end, I realized, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about choosing to let go, to move forward with a sense of peace, a sense of hope. It was about finding a way to live, to love, despite the wounds that had once defined me. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a quiet certainty, a belief that I was finally free to build a new life. A new beginning, grounded in the strength I had found within myself. There was a part of me that wanted to let the past go quietly, to put my aunt's betrayal behind me and move forward without ever confronting her. But the more time passed, the more I realized that her actions still haunted me, still lingered in the shadows of my mind, holding me back from the peace I so desperately wanted. I needed to face her, to hear her side of the story, even if it would only confirm what I already knew. Confronting her felt like the final piece, the last step in a journey that had been both painful and transformative. I called her one evening, my voice steady but distant as I asked to meet. She sounded surprised but agreed, her tone betraying a hint of nervousness. I imagined that she must have sensed something was amiss after all. I had distanced myself from her for years. Ever since that day my parents had disowned me. The rift had grown quietly, unspoken, but it was there, a canyon between us. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. I arrived early, watching the world move around me as I waited, my mind a turbulent mix of memories and questions. I wasn't sure what I hoped to gain from this meeting. Perhaps an apology, or an explanation that would help me make sense of the senseless. Perhaps it was simply closure I wanted, a way to leave the past behind with a sense of finality. When my aunt arrived, I saw the hesitation in her face, the flicker of apprehension as she approached. She looked older than I remembered, her face etched with lines of worry and regret. It struck me then that perhaps she, too, had carried the weight of her actions, the burden of guilt that had grown with each passing year. We exchanged polite greetings, though the formality felt hollow, as if we were both dancing around the truth, avoiding the confrontation that lay beneath the surface. As we sat down, an uneasy silence settled between us, thick and unyielding. She glanced at me, her gaze flickering with something I couldn't quite read, an emotion that felt like regret. Or perhaps fear. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and calm, though my heart pounded in my chest. I need to know why, I said, my words cutting through the silence. Why did you tell my parents those things? Why did you make them believe I was someone I wasn't? She looked away, her hands clasped tightly on the table, as if grounding herself. There was a long pause, a moment where I thought she might brush off my question, deflect it with vague excuses. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost fragile, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. I was jealous, she admitted, her gaze fixed on the table. Jealous of the relationship you had with your parents, the way they loved you. I had always wanted that kind of closeness, but it was something I never felt with my own family. When I saw how much they adored you, how proud they were, it was like a mirror, reflecting everything I didn't have. Her words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I struggled to comprehend the depth of her confession. Jealousy. It felt like such a petty, trivial reason, but as she spoke, I began to see the layers of hurt and longing that had shaped her actions. She had been driven by her own pain, her own sense of inadequacy, and in a twisted way, she had tried to sabotage the love that I had taken for granted. I didn't plan it, she continued, her voice trembling. It wasn't something I did deliberately, but once I started planting those seeds of doubt, it became easier to keep going. I convinced myself that it was for the best, that your parents would be better off if they saw you as flawed, as less than perfect. The words stung, each one a reminder of the pain she had caused, the trust she had shattered. But beneath the anger, I felt a strange sense of pity, a recognition of the emptiness that had driven her to such lengths. She had spent years chasing something she could never have, and in doing so, she had destroyed the very thing she claimed to want: a family. A sense of belonging. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I wish I could go back, undo what I did. I see the damage I caused, the pain I put you through, and I hate myself for it. I looked at her, taking in the guilt, the regret that had etched itself into her face. It would have been easy to hate her, to let my anger consume me, to let her words fuel the resentment that still lingered within me. But in that moment, I felt something shift, a sense of understanding, a recognition of her humanity, her flaws. Your apology doesn't erase the past, I said softly, my voice steady, but I appreciate it. I needed to hear the truth, to understand why. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, relief. It was clear that she, too, had been carrying a burden, a weight that had finally been lifted with her confession. We sat in silence for a few moments, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain we had both endured, the wounds we had carried. As I left the cafe, I felt a lightness in my chest, a sense of release that I hadn't expected. The anger was still there, a small ember that would take time to extinguish, but it no longer consumed me. I had faced the truth, had looked into the eyes of the person who had hurt me, And in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself that I had lost. In the weeks that followed, I found myself letting go of the past. Little by little, my relationship with my parents grew stronger, each meeting filled with a new sense of understanding, a recognition of the journey we had all been on. The scars would always remain, but they no longer held me captive. I was free to build a future, free to love and forgive without the weight of resentment. In time, I found peace, a quiet acceptance of the past and a renewed hope for the future. The journey had been painful, filled with moments of doubt and despair, but it had also brought me a strength, a resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. Looking back, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain or erasing the hurt. It was about finding a way to live beyond it, to embrace the person I had become, shaped by both the wounds and the healing. And in that acceptance, I found the peace I had been searching for all along. After confronting my aunt, after hearing the tangled web of jealousy and pain that had led her to betray me, I thought I might feel a sense of finality, a sense that my journey toward peace was complete. But as the days went by, I realized there was still one piece left, one thing that hadn't yet been resolved. That held me back from fully moving forward. My parents had never truly apologized. They had hinted at it, had shown remorse in their own ways. But the words themselves, the simple acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, had never come, and as much as I wanted to let it go, to tell myself that it no longer mattered, I knew that a part of me still longed to hear those words. To feel that validation, however late it might be. One evening, after dinner with my parents, I felt the weight of that missing piece more acutely than ever. We had sat in their living room, talking about trivial things, the weather, upcoming holidays, small memories that felt both comforting and bittersweet. But beneath the surface, I sensed that same tension, the unspoken truth that lingered between us, waiting to be addressed. As the conversation lulled, my father cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his hands. I could see the hesitation in his posture, the way he seemed to brace himself, as if preparing for something difficult. I waited, my heart pounding, as he finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "We've never really said it," he began, his voice rough. "I know we've tried to explain ourselves, to tell you how we feel, but we've never actually said how sorry we are." The words hung in the air, filled with a weight that felt almost tangible. My mother reached for his hand, her expression filled with a quiet resolve, as if she, too, had been waiting for this moment, had felt the need to finally put the past into words. "We hurt you in ways we can never fully understand," she said softly, her gaze steady, "and for that, we are so deeply, deeply sorry. We failed you when you needed us most. We didn't trust you, didn't believe in you, and that's something we'll have to live with for the rest of our lives." The sincerity in her voice, the rawness of their words, struck a chord within me, a part of me that had been holding on to the pain, to the resentment, waiting for this very moment. I had told myself that I didn't need an apology, that I could move on without it. But hearing the words, hearing them take responsibility for the hurt they had caused, brought a sense of relief I hadn't anticipated, a release of emotions I hadn't even known I was carrying. "We let our own fears, our own insecurities, cloud our judgment," my father continued, his voice breaking slightly. "We let someone else's words poison our love for you, and that is something we will always regret." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, a mixture of sadness and relief washing over me as I listened to their words. For years, I had carried the weight of their betrayal, had let it shape my life, my choices, my sense of self. But now, hearing him acknowledge the depth of their mistake, I felt a part of that weight begin to lift, a sense of validation that soothed the wounds I had thought would never fully heal. "We can't change the past," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion, "but we want you to know that we love you, and that we will spend the rest of our lives trying to make it up to you. If there's anything we can do, anything at all, please, just tell us." Their words, their apology, felt like a balm, a salve on wounds that had been raw for far too long. And in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act, a single choice. It was a journey, a series of decisions made over and over again, each one bringing me closer to peace. I had already forgiven them in small ways, had already taken steps toward healing. But this, their apology, felt like the final piece, the missing link that allowed me to fully let go. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I looked at them, feeling a sense of calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance of both the pain and the love that had shaped our journey. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for saying that." They both looked at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the forgiveness I was offering, even if it was still incomplete, still tinged with the echoes of the past. We sat in silence for a few moments, letting the weight of the apology settle, letting the healing take root in the quiet space between us. In the days that followed, I felt a newfound sense of freedom, a release from the resentment that had once held me captive. My parents' apology had given me the closure I needed, the validation I had longed for, And in its wake, I found a quiet strength, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of forgiveness and healing. Our relationship remained imperfect, still scarred by the wounds of the past, but it was stronger now, grounded in honesty, in a mutual understanding of the pain we had all endured. I no longer needed them to make amends, to prove their love or their remorse. Their apology had been enough, a final acknowledgement of the journey we had all traveled, the pain we had all faced, and the love that, despite everything, still held us together. Looking back, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or excusing the pain. It was about finding a way to live beyond it, to embrace the person I had become, shaped by both the hurt and the healing. And in that acceptance, I found the peace I had been searching for, a quiet certainty that I was finally free. Free to build a new life, a new beginning, with a family that, though fractured, was still whole in its own way. Free to embrace the future without the weight of resentment, without the shadows of betrayal. Free to love, to forgive, and to move forward, knowing that the scars I carried were not a mark of weakness, but a testament to the strength I had found within myself. In the end, the journey to forgiveness had been long and painful, filled with moments of doubt and despair, but it had also brought me a sense of clarity, a resilience that would carry me forward, guiding me as I built a life grounded in peace, in hope, in the quiet knowledge that I had overcome the darkness and emerged stronger, whole, and unbroken. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. I've come to realize, it's not a neat line in the sand, a decision that, once made, wipes the slate clean. Forgiveness is more like a choice you make every day, a quiet resolve to let go, to release the grip of resentment, even when it resurfaces. And sometimes, the process is slower than you'd like, less straightforward. Some days, the anger lingers, the old wounds flare up, but with each passing moment, I've felt those scars settle into something different, not reminders of pain, but markers of resilience, of a life reshaped and rebuilt. After my parents' apology, a strange peace settled over me. For so long, I had been defined by the betrayal, by the family that had cast me aside. Now, though, I felt the weight of those labels: victim, abandoned, rejected, begin to fall away, leaving room for something new, something that felt like freedom. I was no longer bound by the hurt they had caused, no longer a prisoner to the choices they had made. I was simply myself, a person who had endured, who had survived and come through the other side. Our family felt different now, fragile but authentic. There was no pretense, no attempt to sweep the past under the rug. We were all aware of the hurt that had been done, of the mistakes that had nearly broken us. But in that awareness, I found a strange kind of strength, a recognition that we could still be a family, even if we were forever changed. We had boundaries now, unspoken but firm. I no longer felt the need to please them, to seek their approval. I was my own person, and they were no longer the pillars of my identity. They were family, yes, but they were also individuals with their own flaws, their own weaknesses. Seeing them as people, rather than the idealized figures I'd once clung to, allowed me to interact with them more openly, without the weight of expectation or fear of disappointment. As we continued to spend time together, I noticed how these boundaries strengthened our bond rather than weakening it. There was a quiet understanding between us, a respect for the journey we had all taken, for the scars we had all earned. My parents no longer tried to smooth things over, to pretend that everything was perfect. Instead, they met me where I was, accepting the changes in me, the independence I had carved out for myself over the years. One day, as we were sitting in their backyard, watching the sunset dip below the trees, my mother turned to me with a soft smile. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that felt both familiar and new. "You've grown so much, and I can see how strong you've become. I just want you to know that." Her words caught me off guard, a gentle acknowledgement of the person I had become, a person shaped by both the love and the loss I had endured. I felt a swell of gratitude, not just for her words but for the journey that had led me here. The resilience I had found within myself. I had spent so many years defining myself by my family's rejection, by the betrayal that had left me feeling lost and unworthy. But now, with the distance and the healing that had come, I saw myself differently. I was not defined by my past, by the people who had once failed me. I was defined by the strength I had found, by the forgiveness I had chosen, by the life I had built in spite of everything. As the months passed, I found myself settling into a new kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of both the family I had and the family I had lost. I no longer needed their approval, their validation. I was whole on my own, complete in a way I hadn't known was possible. And yet, in that wholeness, I found a new appreciation for my family, a willingness to embrace them as they were, imperfect and flawed. There were moments, of course, when the old pain would resurface, when a stray memory or a familiar phrase would trigger a pang of hurt. But each time, I reminded myself that forgiveness was a journey, a choice I would continue to make. I didn't have to be perfect, I didn't have to let go of everything all at once. Healing, I had learned, was a lifelong process, one that would shape and change me as I grew. With time, I even found a place for my aunt in my heart, a quiet corner where I could acknowledge her as part of my story. A person who had played a role in my journey, even if her actions had caused me pain. I no longer felt the need to confront her, to seek retribution or closure. I had found my own closure, my own peace, and in that peace, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't known I was missing. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing to live beyond it, to find a way to embrace the future without the weight of the past. It was about allowing myself to love and be loved, to open my heart to the people who had once hurt me. Not because I needed them, but because I was strong enough to accept them as they were. And in that acceptance, I found a new kind of strength, a resilience that would carry me forward, guiding me as I built a life grounded in peace, in hope, in the quiet certainty that I was free, free to choose my own path, free to define my own story, free to build a life filled with the love and connection I had once thought was lost forever. As I stood on the brink of this new beginning, I felt a quiet sense of joy, a recognition that the journey I had taken had brought me closer to myself, to the person I was always meant to be, and in that self, I found a peace that would carry me forward, a peace that would allow me to embrace the future with an open heart, unburdened by the past, and ready to live fully, freely, and without fear. After so many years of feeling tied to the past, it was strange to wake up one morning and feel free. The weight of my family's betrayal, the anger that had once fueled me, felt like it had finally lifted. It hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened, settled into something quiet and manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. I began to fill my days with things that brought me joy. Things that were mine and mine alone. I'd always been hesitant to put down roots, to build something that felt like a life of my own. There had been too much fear of failure, of being let down, of trusting and being hurt all over again. But now, I felt a kind of strength, a sense of grounding that I hadn't known before. I started with small things, redecorating my apartment, choosing colors and textures that felt like home. I hung up photos of places I'd been, books that I'd loved, pieces of artwork that spoke to me. It was a simple thing, really, but it gave me a sense of ownership, a feeling that I belonged here, in this space, in this life I was crafting. My friendships, too, deepened as I let myself open up, share my story, my vulnerabilities. For so long, I had carried my pain as a private burden, a secret that I guarded fiercely, afraid that it would drive people away. But as I shared more of myself with those around me, I found that people were willing to meet me where I was, to support me, to be there without judgment. In letting others in, I found a sense of community, a feeling of connection that I hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, as I sat in a small cafe with Claire, a friend I'd grown close to over the years, I felt a strange urge to tell her everything. The story of my family, the journey I'd taken to forgive, the pain and the healing. She listened quietly, her expression soft, her eyes kind, and when I finished, she simply reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. "I can't imagine going through everything you've been through, but you made it. You're here, and that's something to be proud of." Her words resonated with me, a reminder that I wasn't defined by the hurt I'd endured, but by the strength I'd found in overcoming it. I had spent so long feeling broken, incomplete, but now, I realized that I was whole, that my scars were a testament to my resilience, my ability to move forward. With each passing day, I felt myself letting go of the need for validation, for approval from anyone other than myself. I began to set goals, to dream again. I thought about the things I wanted, the life I wanted to create. I no longer felt bound by my family's expectations, by the roles I had once felt forced into. I was free to choose, to define myself on my own terms, to build a future that was grounded in my own values, my own desires. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey I had taken, for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had found within myself. My family's betrayal had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the hurt I had endured, more than the mistakes they had made. I was a person who had faced darkness and found light, who had chosen to forgive, to let go, to live without fear. Over time, my relationship with my parents settled into a steady rhythm, a quiet, gentle connection that no longer carried the weight of expectation. We spoke often, sharing small updates, stories, pieces of our lives. I visited them for holidays, for birthdays, for quiet Sunday afternoons. There was an ease between us, a sense of mutual respect and understanding. They no longer felt the need to make amends, to prove their love or their regret. We had moved beyond that, had found a new balance that felt both comforting and liberating. With my aunt, the relationship remained distant, quiet. We exchanged pleasantries at family gatherings, small talk that felt polite but empty. I no longer felt the need to confront her, to seek explanations or apologies. I had found my own peace, my own closure, and I was content to leave her as a part of my past. A chapter that no longer held any power over me. As the months turned into years, I felt myself growing, changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I pursued new hobbies, traveled to places I had always wanted to see, embraced opportunities that once felt impossible. I no longer held myself back, no longer allowed fear or doubt to dictate my choices. I was free, unburdened by the past, guided by a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of forgiveness and healing. And in that freedom, I found a joy that was both profound and simple, a joy in the everyday moments, the warmth of the sun on my face, the laughter of friends, the peace of a quiet morning. I had spent so long searching for happiness, for a sense of belonging, but now, I realized that it had been within me all along, waiting for me to let go, to trust in myself, to embrace the life I was meant to live. One evening, as I sat with my parents on the back porch, watching the sunset dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We sat in comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but connected in a way that felt natural, unforced. There was no need for words, no need to revisit the past. We had made our peace, had found a way to move forward, to love each other as we were, flaws and all. Looking back on the journey, I realized that forgiveness had given me something far greater than closure. It had given me the freedom to live fully, to love deeply, to embrace both the beauty and the pain of life without fear. It had taught me that I was strong, resilient, capable of facing whatever challenges life might bring, and in that strength, I found a sense of purpose, a commitment to live each day with gratitude, with joy, with a heart that was open to both love and loss. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the world, I felt a quiet certainty, a belief that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The journey had been long, had taken me through valleys of pain and peaks of healing, but it had brought me home to myself, to a life grounded in love, in forgiveness, in a deep, abiding peace. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of excitement, a hope that was both fierce and gentle. I was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to embrace the unknown, to live with an open heart, unburdened by the past, and guided by the strength I had found within myself. It's been years now, and life has unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. Time has a way of softening the edges of pain, of dulling the sting of old wounds. And in that softening, I've come to understand things I once thought I'd never accept. Forgiveness, I've learned, is an ongoing act, a choice that must be made day by day, moment by moment. Some days, forgiveness is as simple as breathing, a natural rhythm that settles easily into the fabric of my life. But there are days, too, when the old hurt rises, when memories resurface, and I find myself facing that choice all over again. In the years that have passed, I've watched my family grow and change. My parents, once the figures of my deepest pain, have become my greatest allies, my closest confidants. We speak freely now, openly, without the weight of resentment or expectation. They have come to know me in ways they never did before. Not as a child or a source of pride, but as a person, as an equal, someone with her own dreams, her own strength. Our relationship is far from perfect, but it's real, grounded in a mutual respect and understanding that would have been impossible if we hadn't walked through fire together. We've all changed, in our own ways, softened by the journey, humbled by the scars we carry. We no longer pretend to be more than we are. We are a family. Flawed and human, held together by the quiet love that has survived. Against all odds, my aunt and I have remained distant. Our relationship polite but distant. She is still a part of my life, a presence at family gatherings, a name in my contacts. But she no longer holds power over me, no longer casts a shadow over my peace. I have let go of the need for retribution, for answers, for an apology that may never come. I've come to realize that her actions were a reflection of her own pain, her own insecurities, and while I may never understand her choices, I no longer need to. I am free from her, from the grip her betrayal once held over my life. Forgiveness, I've found, isn't a gift I gave to my family, it's a gift I gave to myself. It has allowed me to live without the weight of anger, to love without fear, to embrace the future without the shadows of the past. It has given me the freedom to open my heart, to build connections, to find joy in the everyday moments that once felt impossible. And in that freedom, I've discovered a resilience, a strength that no one can take from me. There are moments, still, when the past surfaces a scent, a song, a familiar sight, and in those moments, I feel a quiet pride, a sense of accomplishment that I've chosen to rise above the hurt, to define my life by the love I've created rather than the pain I've endured. I am no longer a victim of my family's betrayal. I am a survivor, a person who has faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Looking back, I see the beauty in the journey, in the pain that has shaped me, in the love that has carried me forward. I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the darkest days, for it has brought me to where I am, to the person I was always meant to be. I have learned to let go, to accept the things I cannot change, and to find peace in the present, in the life I am building with open hands and an open heart. In the quiet moments, I feel a deep gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, for the resilience I've discovered within myself. I know now that forgiveness isn't a destination, but a path, a choice that must be made again and again, and as I walk that path, I carry with me a sense of hope, a belief that I am free to live fully, to love deeply, to embrace the unknown with a heart unburdened by fear. The scars remain, a testament to the battles I have fought, the darkness I have overcome, but they no longer hurt, they are simply a part of me. A reminder of the strength I carry, the resilience that defines me. I am no longer afraid of the past, no longer bound by the pain I once held close. I am free, in the truest sense, to build a life that is wholly my own, grounded in love, in peace, in the quiet power of forgiveness. And as I look toward the future, I feel a sense of excitement, a joy that is both fierce and gentle. I am ready for whatever comes, ready to live with an open heart, guided by the strength I have found within myself. I am ready to embrace both the beauty and the pain of life, to find meaning in the moments, to love and be loved, unburdened by the past, and filled with hope for what lies ahead. In the end, forgiveness has given me a gift far greater than peace. It has given me the freedom to be fully, truly alive,